All across the country, companies manufacture products that are part of our daily lives. Every year, they spend billions of dollars to make sure that industrial byproducts don't pollute our air and water. Pollution has dangerous effects. Smog covers our cities, and holes have appeared in the ozone layer of the atmosphere. The ozone layer prevents dangerous ultraviolet rays from reaching the Earth. Pollution also threatens the Earth's water. Chemical runoff from fields into streams and sewage being dumped into rivers makes clean water harder to find. The environment is delicate, and protecting it is everyone's responsibility. Your employer needs all of the employees to help stay within the rules of the EPA. Pay attention to the information in this course. It's good for you, your employer, and your community. In 1962, Rachel Carson, a former employee of the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service, wrote a book entitled Silent Spring. Silent Spring was about the effects of pesticides on birds and other wildlife. It started a groundswell of concern about the effects of modern life on the environment. Touted as miracle cures for vermin and insect problems and the diseases they carried, pesticides like DDT mushroomed in use after World War II. In 1955 alone, more than 600 million pounds of DDT were sprayed over crops, forests, and wetlands across the United States. Farmers loved DDT because it was cheap and lasted a long time. People loved DDT because the widespread spraying kept food costs low and controlled mosquitoes and flies and the diseases they carried. But Carson's book painted another story. Robins were dying from eating poisoned worms. Bald eagles and many other birds were having trouble producing young. The air in cities was so dirty that it left soot on cars and homes and kept many people from seeing the sun or breathing freely. Open garbage dumps burned and smoldered, sending smoke and fumes across cities and towns. Rivers and creeks were filled with dead fish and covered by an oily film that choked out plants. The Cuyahoga River in Ohio even caught fire in 1969 and burned for days. Efforts to clean up the environment cost money. Crop losses increased and food prices rose when certain pesticides were banned. Factories might go out of business if they had to change the way they operated. Jobs would be lost and communities left impoverished. There were no laws regarding the environment. Several companies began to embrace environmentally friendly ideas, but the public wanted more action. Congress and dozens of government departments scrambled to get a handle on this very difficult problem. They took bits and pieces of various departments and created a new agency to deal with all environmental matters. The Environmental Protection Agency was born in December 1970. Its mission. Today, the EPA oversees comprehensive environmental laws enacted by Congress over several decades. Laws enacted by Congress focus EPA's programs on four main areas: air quality, water quality, waste materials, and chemical safety and use. Rules that the EPA writes to administer these laws control everything that goes into the air, the water, and the land. Each of the laws that the EPA administers was enacted by Congress to address specific environmental concerns. Each law requires the EPA to write regulations, and many laws even set specific deadlines for the rules to be issued. The EPA does not directly regulate worker safety. That job belongs to the Occupational Safety and Health Administration, or OSHA. Nor does it regulate food, drugs, or cosmetics. Consumer products, wildlife protection, and national parks also fall outside EPA's realm. The EPA findings, however, affect workplace practices, consumer products, transportation, construction, agriculture, and even the design of heavy equipment and military systems. Scientific studies and data developed by the EPA are used by many government agencies to control situations that could harm the environment if left unchecked. Much of what the EPA regulates is chemicals and similar things that could harm people and the natural world. The EPA also regulates insecticides used on crops, pets, and even on people to kill head lice. The EPA rules monitor air and water quality, and when the useful life of a substance is past, the EPA decides how the residues are handled. The formation of the EPA changed things for everyone. Ordinary people now recycle their motor oil, cans, and newspapers. They can't buy chlorofluorocarbons or CFCs to recharge the air conditioners in their cars. Management of water, air, trash, and underground tanks now complies with EPA regulations. At work, employees follow strict operating procedures and hazardous waste regulations. They learn about chemical hazards and spill cleanup, and they continually work to keep fleet vehicles and equipment in top shape. The raw materials that go into a facility and the wastes that come out have to be counted, reported, cleaned up, and permitted. The EPA regulations are designed to protect human health by controlling environmental hazards. One of the EPA's responsibilities is making sure all residents of the United States have clean air. Air pollution is regulated because it has harmful effects. It can make you sick, give you cancer, and cause birth defects. Some hazardous substances can kill if even a small amount is inhaled. Air pollution also harms the environment and property. Under the Clean Air Act, the EPA controls air pollution by setting air quality standards, limits on the amounts of common chemicals and other substances that the air may contain. The standards are enforced by the states, which must submit plans to the EPA outlining how all areas of the state will meet the national standards. These plans are called State Implementation Plans, or SIPs. The SIPs spell out how each state will meet the national air quality standards. They include the kinds of programs and controls that the state will use. States may impose tougher requirements than the EPA, but not weaker ones. If a state is not doing a good job in cleaning up the air, the EPA takes over. Just as air quality varies by area, so do the pollution control requirements that are imposed under the SIPs. That's why facilities in areas with dirtier air must meet tougher requirements than those in areas where the air is cleaner. When you see air quality alerts, they are issued because pollutant levels in the area are too high. Many such areas also impose inspection and maintenance, or IM programs, that require emissions tests on vehicles. The idea is to cut down on the pollution that cars add to the air. Before industrial facilities can operate, each facility must get and pay for an air pollution permit. The permit requires operating controls and equipment, employee training, and even community involvement. The goal is to make sure the air leaving the facility is as clean as possible, so that it meets the conditions set out in the permit. A second goal is protection of the community. With so many air pollutants carrying the possibility of major health effects, or even death, people who live near facilities want their air to be safe. And most facilities want to be good neighbors. After all, their job is creating products, not dealing with complaints. Besides, the people who work in these facilities have to breathe the local air too. The EPA regulates air pollution by placing controls on sources that emit pollutants. There are two kinds of sources, mobile and stationary. Mobile sources are things like vehicles and airplanes and other things that move around. Stationary sources are things like factories and power plants and things that stay in one place. Many people think that industrial facilities are responsible for most air pollution. In fact, motor vehicles account for half of most chemical pollutants and 90% of all carbon monoxide. Air pollution is controlled by requiring owners of mobile and stationary sources to get permits before they can operate. A vehicle emissions test is a kind of permit. It checks the amount of air pollution the vehicle produces and allows continued use only if it complies with the limits. The permits for stationary sources, like industrial facilities, are far more complex. For them, each permit includes information on the operations, the pollutants being released, how much may be released, and the steps the facility must take to reduce pollution. The permit also includes information on how the facility will monitor its pollution levels. All of these items are called permit conditions. A facility that fails to meet its permit conditions may be shut down or fined. Just as there are two classes of pollution sources, there are two kinds of pollutants. Each kind is regulated differently. The first class is called criteria pollutants and is covered in the EPA air quality standards. The EPA calls these criteria air pollutants because the amount of pollution allowed in the air is determined by the health-based criteria drawn from after scientific study. These pollutants can injure health, harm the environment, and cause property damage. They are found all over the United States. The second group of pollutants is called toxic air pollutants. They are considered more immediately dangerous to health. Toxic air pollutants are released from stationary sources throughout the country and from motor vehicles like fleet cars and trucks. There are 188 substances listed by Congress as hazardous air pollutants, or HAPs. The EPA regulates the hazardous air pollutants by identifying categories of sources that release the pollutants. For instance, a service station would be in a different category than an industrial chemical plant. The EPA then requires each facility in a category to control its releases. All sources in a category, such as service stations, must meet the same control requirements and methods to reduce the amount released. This is different from criteria pollutants, which are regulated by the amount in the air rather than by the amount generated. Let's look at your role in helping your facility protect air quality. Regularly read and use the Material Safety Data Sheets, also known as the MSDSs. MSDSs provide information about every chemical in your area. Proper use and storage information is listed on the MSDS, as well as how to clean up spills. The MSDS also lists what kind of protective gear you need, which substances must be kept separated or at special temperatures, and if the substance poses a fire or explosion hazard. Remember that the substances you use affect the air, especially gases and liquids like solvents. Use them properly and make sure to avoid spills and leaks. Control dust and vapors by following safe work practices for construction, demolition, and cleanup work. For example, when cleaning an area where dust might contain hazardous substances, use a vacuum cleaner with a filter instead of a broom. Some airborne substances like lead are extremely hazardous. All airborne particles contribute to air pollution. Learn everything you can about the operations you perform and the work you do. Learn the operating procedures for all processes and equipment. Learn all requirements for your job and ask your supervisor about anything you don't understand. The specialized training you receive is part of your facility's efforts to control air pollution. Pay special attention to any monitoring or record-keeping you're asked to perform. This may mean keeping logs of operating data and parameters, or collecting air or emission samples. Maintain all equipment according to manufacturer's specifications and good engineering practices. Keeping your equipment in good operating condition will prevent leaks or worn parts that could lead to a release of hazardous substances. Don't tamper with emission controls on equipment, machinery, and vehicles. Not only does this equipment protect the air, it is a federal crime to remove or disable it. You may be asked to serve on a team that evaluates the potential for releases of hazardous chemicals from your facility. This involves looking at process operations and equipment to find any problems that might lead to an accidental release. Know how to recognize an emergency situation and what your response should be. In an emergency, you must be able to act immediately. Many facilities conduct drills and other exercises to test their plan for responding to an emergency. In a real emergency, there is no time to figure out what to do, so learn your role before a real problem comes up. Because vehicles create a large percentage of all air pollution, people who deal with fleet vehicles and heavy equipment have a special responsibility. Keep all vehicles in top condition according to manufacturer's specifications. Perform routine maintenance as scheduled. When refueling or adding fluids, be careful to avoid spills and leaks. If spills occur, clean them up promptly and properly. Use solvents and petroleum-based cleaning products sparingly and properly. Vapors from these products are hazardous and contribute to air pollution. Make sure to follow safe work practices on protective equipment, ventilation, and proper disposal of wastes and contaminated rags. All this information is part of keeping within the facility's air permit conditions. If it's not done right, the facility's future and your job could be on the line. Complying with the Clean Air Act is tough for employees and facilities. It takes constant awareness of every action and constant attention to safe operations and work practices. But the benefits of clean air are many, from better health and safer communities to cleaner buildings and bluer skies. Each time you think about how difficult it is to comply, think about how much you, your coworkers, and your families enjoy the benefits. Not long ago, the Environmental Protection Agency fined a Colorado company $22 million for degrading wetlands and streams on a construction project. In the same month, executives of a West Virginia company were fined and sent to jail for polluting a tributary of the Ohio River. These two cases, and hundreds more, show how serious the EPA is about protecting water quality in the United States. As a basic element in the food chain, water affects the health of humans and everything that lives in water or needs it to survive. Contaminated water causes a variety of illnesses and diseases. Some come from drinking it and range from mild stomach upset to death. Others come from swimming in it or from eating contaminated fish or shellfish that collect bacteria, toxins, and heavy metals in their tissues. Polluted water kills fish and other aquatic life, wiping out food and homes for other creatures. The EPA rules tackle water quality on two fronts: drinking water and surface waters like rivers, lakes, wetlands, and streams. The goal is to make sure everyone has safe water to drink, now and in the future, and to make all rivers and surface waters safe for fishing and swimming. The water we drink is protected by the Safe Drinking Water Act. It was passed in 1974 to assure the safety of the 34 billion gallons of water people consume every day. Under the Act, the EPA sets limits on contaminants like chemicals and bacteria in water from supply systems. It also protects underground waters called aquifers from chemicals and other things that could ruin drinking water supplies. Using the Safe Drinking Water Act, the EPA sets maximum levels of contaminants like arsenic, pesticides, mercury, radon, and other harmful substances that can be in water. It also sets secondary standards that deal with water's appearance and taste, but these are advisory, not mandatory. Another part of the Act protects drinking water by regulating underground injection of chemicals and other substances that could contaminate aquifers. The underground injection rules apply primarily to waste disposal and to oil, gas, and mineral extraction activities. Surface waters like rivers, lakes, wetlands, and streams are protected by the Clean Water Act. The goal is to make all surface waters safe for fishing and swimming, a target that has only been met in 60% of the waters. Safeguarding surface waters is no small job, especially given the amount in the United States. 3.5 million miles of rivers, 41 million acres of lakes, 277 million acres of wetlands, and 34,400 square miles of estuaries. The EPA protects surface waters by regulating discharges directly into the water and discharges into sewage treatment plants. These discharges are called point source pollution because the source is a well-defined place, like a discharge pipe leading from a factory or sewage treatment plant. Point sources are regulated through a system of the EPA regulations, water quality standards, and permits issued by the states. Of growing concern is non-point source pollution, estimated by the EPA to be the major cause of water pollution. This is pollution that enters surface waters as runoff from roads, parking lots, and farm fields. Controls on this kind of pollution are at the state and local levels, although the EPA has been trying to get a handle on the problem. Non-point source pollution is difficult to regulate because it is so varied, ranging from pesticides, fertilizers, and toxic materials, to antifreeze spilled on your driveway or chemicals used to melt ice on roads. Even particles blown on the wind, like lead dust and ordinary dirt, end up in the water when it rains. There's an old saying that everything you put on the ground ends up in your water. The non-point source pollution problem proves this is true. Each point source of water pollution, like a factory or sewage treatment plant, must have a permit to operate. These are called NPDES permits, for National Pollutant Discharge Elimination System. NPDES permits are issued by the states and specify the EPA standards and limitations that a source must meet. The standards and limitations spell out things like pollution control technology. These must be used at all facilities in a particular industrial group. The standards and limitations also set limits on discharges of specific substances. Facilities that discharge wastewater into local sewer systems also need water discharge permits. These permits, which also are issued by the states, incorporate the EPA pretreatment standards, rules on what must be done to the wastewater before it goes into the sewer. Pretreatment standards are designed to keep facilities from passing industrial wastes into local sewer systems, which are not designed to handle them. In fact, passing heavy metals and other industrial wastes into the sewer system can cause it to malfunction and affect its NPDES permit. Because the risks are so high, treatment plants regularly monitor for toxic materials and other industrial wastes. Process changes or chemical substitutions cannot be made without getting the permit revised, a time-consuming and expensive process. All employees must be trained about operating procedures and how to recognize when something is wrong. Let's look at safe work practices that protect water quality. Read and use MSDSs regularly. They provide information about every chemical in your area. Proper use and storage information is listed on the MSDS. How to clean up spills and which chemicals pose a danger to drinking water or aquatic life is also included. Using MSDSs is a good way to protect yourself, your coworkers, and the water quality in your community. Remember that every substance you use and discard eventually ends up in the water. Avoid spills and leaks and know proper disposal methods. Learn everything you can about the operations you perform and the work you do. Learn the operating procedures for all processes and equipment. Learn all requirements for your job and ask your supervisor about anything you don't understand. The specialized training you receive is part of your facility's efforts to control water pollution. Pay special attention to any monitoring or record-keeping you're asked to perform. This may mean keeping logs of operating data and parameters, or collecting water or discharge samples. Because water permits are so stringent, never make any change to an operation or add a new substance without approval. This could create a serious hazard or violate water quality regulations and your facility's permit conditions. Read and follow label directions and manufacturer's instructions for all substances you use at work. This includes pesticides, cleaning supplies, solvents, fuels, cutting oils, paints, coatings, and lubricants. Be careful of the cleaning agents and solvents you use, and never use new ones without checking to find out the right way to dispose of the wastes. Dispose of substances like used motor oil and old paint properly. If in doubt about proper disposal methods, consult your supervisor or the MSDS for the substance. Never pour wastes on the ground. This not only endangers water quality, it violates many of the EPA rules and could result in major problems for your facility. Never flush industrial wastes down a sewer or pour them into a toilet. Learn the proper way to dispose of these items to make sure you're not putting your facility's permit at risk. Be careful about things like runoff when you do cleanup or construction. Both chemical substances spilled on the ground and things like dirt and dust degrade the quality of surface and groundwaters. Some, like pesticides and oil, can kill aquatic life and contaminate water even in small amounts. Never squirt away a chemical spill with a hose without checking to see if it's okay. You may be creating a serious situation. Control runoff when doing outdoor work. This includes things like dirt during earth moving and excavation operations and chemicals like pesticides, fertilizers, weed killers, and ice melting compounds. Know how to recognize an emergency situation and what your response should be. In an emergency, you must be able to act immediately without thinking or consulting operating procedures. Learn the proper way to report and clean up spills in your work area. Know where spilled supplies are kept and learn how to use them. Make sure to wear proper protective gear. Dispose of used cleanup equipment properly. Notify your supervisor of all spills and emergencies regardless of size. Many spills and releases must be reported to local, state, and federal authorities. Failure to do so carries heavy fines and even criminal penalties. People in the United States create a lot of waste materials, more than 4 pounds per person per day, or 209 million tons each year. Industry creates even more, over 250 million tons of hazardous waste, and more than 7 billion tons of non-hazardous waste each year. Congress passed the Resource Conservation and Recovery Act, called RCRA, RCRA, to promote recycling and to shift waste disposal from open dumps to sanitary landfills. But a number of events caused Congress to broaden the law and enact other laws aimed at controlling environmental hazards posed by chemicals and waste materials. The first of these events occurred in 1978, when 82 different long-buried chemicals bubbled out of the ground in a neighborhood near Niagara Falls, New York. Known as Love Canal, the situation prompted Congress and the courts to order the EPA to issue strict regulations on how all hazardous wastes would be handled in the future. Congress enacted a new law to clean up sites where hazardous wastes were already buried improperly. This new law, the Comprehensive Environmental Response, Compensation, and Liability Act, or CERCLA, C-E-R-C-L-A, became known as the Superfund Law. The second event occurred when a massive release of methyl isocyanate at a facility in Bhopal, India, killed thousands of people. When CERCLA was amended by SARA, Title III, or EPCRA, required facilities to report to local and state agencies. The reports cover the broad areas of materials on hand and spill or accidental releases. RCRA provides cradle-to-grave regulation of substances that could harm people or the environment if discarded improperly. CERCLA and SARA require the cleanup of former improper waste sites and coordination with state and local agencies to minimize the effects of future spills and accidental release. RCRA controls the generation, storage, transport, and disposal of hazardous wastes. The EPA enforces the law with a maze of regulations that are among the most complex ever written by the federal government. Under RCRA, the EPA lists wastes that are considered hazardous to health or the environment if disposed of improperly. Wastes are considered hazardous if either of two situations applies. One, they are among the 400 substances listed by the EPA because they're known to be harmful to human health or the environment when not managed properly. Or, two, they exhibit one or more of the following characteristics. They are ignitable, corrosive, reactive, or toxic. Hazardous wastes can be liquids, solids, or contained gases. They may be discarded products or may be byproducts of various operations or processes. Sometimes a hazardous waste is a specific substance, like spent solvents or mercury or battery acid, that could come from many kinds of facilities. Other times, it is a waste stream that is generated by a single kind of industrial operation, like ink sludge. Virtually anyone who generates, treats, stores, disposes, or transports hazardous wastes is covered by the RCRA regulations. The goal is to track hazardous wastes from the moment they are created through storage, transport, and final disposal or treatment. Penalties for violating the law are high. Fines up to $1 million and jail terms of up to 15 years. Facilities that create hazardous wastes are called hazardous waste generators. Generators can be small businesses like an equipment repair shop. This kind of business might do degreasing, equipment cleaning, rust removal, paint preparation, painting, paint removal, and brush cleaning. Kinds of hazardous waste generated are likely to be acids or bases, toxic wastes, ignitable wastes, paint wastes, and used solvents. Or a generator may be a large industrial facility that generates many different kinds of wastes in large quantities. A large manufacturing facility that carried out many different processes and used many different chemicals would be an example. If the wastes are listed or exhibit any of EPA's hazardous characteristics, the generator must check the amount that is created. Depending on the kind of waste, creating as little as 2.2 pounds per month brings a facility under the RCRA rules. If the wastes meet the RCRA hazard and quantity criteria, The generator must register with the EPA and obtain an identification number. The registration and other reports tell the EPA the identity and amounts of hazardous wastes that are being created at the facility. Generators also must track where all hazardous wastes go when they leave the facility and make sure they are disposed of properly. Facilities that treat, store, or dispose of hazardous wastes are called TSD facilities and need special permits to operate. As with many other environmental laws, these permits are issued by the states but must follow the EPA rules. A TSD facility can be a treatment facility like an incinerator, a disposal facility like a hazardous waste landfill, or a storage facility that temporarily holds hazardous wastes that are awaiting treatment or disposal. Sometimes generators also need TSD permits. This happens if they collect wastes on site for more than a short time, or if they treat or dispose of wastes on the site. Hazardous waste operations, whether generators or TSD facilities, must comply with a large number of EPA rules. These involve registering with the EPA, obtaining needed permits and following permit conditions, filing required paperwork on all wastes, evaluating, collecting, storing, and labeling all wastes according to the EPA technical standards, preparing, monitoring, and tracking shipments when wastes leave the facility, creating plans for preventing and responding to emergencies, training employees in hazardous waste management and emergency response. All of these activities are time-consuming, difficult, and expensive. In fact, disposal costs for hazardous wastes are so high that most generators are streamlining operations and taking other steps to reduce the amounts that are created. These changes include substituting less hazardous substances in their operations and reusing and recycling wastes that previously would have been thrown away. For employees, the hazardous waste regulations bring major responsibilities. Many of these responsibilities are spelled out in rules written by OSHA and other agencies as part of the government's united effort to protect both people and the environment from the effects of improper waste disposal. EPA regulations generally define hazardous waste and create standards for waste generators, transporters, and TDSFs. OSHA regulations, on the other hand, specify safe working conditions and procedures when handling chemicals and hazardous waste. By EPA standards, containers of hazardous waste must be kept closed unless waste is to be added or removed. OSHA standards require use of gloves when handling wastes and respirators if air contamination exceeds chemical-specified levels. Let's look at your role in helping your facility control hazardous wastes. Read and use Material Safety Data Sheets, or MSDSs, regularly. They provide information about every chemical in your area. Proper use and storage information is listed on the MSDS, as well as how to clean up spills. What kind of protective gear you need is also listed. Which substances must be kept separated or at special temperatures, and which ones must be handled as hazardous wastes is included in the MSDS. The hazardous waste training you receive is part of your facility's efforts to protect both you and the environment. Learn all requirements for your job and ask your supervisor about anything you don't understand. Learn to identify all hazardous wastes in your area. Learn the specific handling, labeling, and disposal requirements for each one. Always wear the proper protective equipment and wear it properly as described in your training. Your supervisor will show you the equipment you need to wear for work. Read all container labels and understand your facility's storage and labeling system. This helps prevent mistakes that could have serious consequences. Place hazardous wastes into the proper container and make sure the container is labeled for the wastes you are handling. Mixing of certain wastes not only violates EPA regulations, but may also cause fires, explosions, or generation of hazardous vapors. Store all waste containers properly. This means separating them by contents and hazards in line with strict requirements that prevent fires, explosions, or chemical reactions. Pay special attention to any container labeling or record keeping you're asked to perform. This may mean creating labels or storage logs, or even preparing shipping papers for wastes leaving the facility. Read and follow label directions and manufacturer's instructions for all substances you use at work. Improper use leads to many environmental problems, including excess waste production. This includes pesticides, cleaning supplies, solvents, fuels, inks, paints, coatings, and lubricants. Even some office and medical products are considered hazardous wastes and must be handled very carefully. Know how to recognize an emergency situation and know what your response should be. In an emergency, you must be able to act immediately without thinking or consulting operating procedures. Emergencies like fires and spills can lead to serious hazardous waste problems. Learn how to recognize when a situation, like a fire, a spill, or a leak, is beyond your control. Make sure you know what to do in such cases. Learn the proper way to report and clean up spills in your work area. Consult the MSDS and your supervisor if you're not sure of the right way to proceed. Failure to work carefully around hazardous wastes is not only dangerous, it also can bring major problems and costs for the facility. CERCLA is the next major waste law that the EPA oversees. Also called the Superfund Law, CERCLA illustrates what can happen if hazardous wastes are not handled properly. We'll look at it briefly. The goal of the Superfund Law is to clean up abandoned hazardous waste sites, sites where bad disposal methods created problems years later. Since the law was enacted in 1980, about 350 sites have been cleaned up. Another 1,000 of the most hazardous sites are awaiting or undergoing cleanup. Many thousands more, as many as 30,000, will need to be cleaned up but are not yet listed as priorities. In fact, the EPA estimates that more than 73 million people live within 4 miles of one or more such sites. Many of the sites were not officially used for waste disposal, but are abandoned industrial properties that are contaminated because of past disposal practices. The EPA is exploring ways to encourage use of these sites for development after cleanup by finding a way to protect the owners from future liability claims. Billions of dollars have already been spent to clean up Superfund sites. any one of which can cost millions. The cleanup money comes from two sources: taxes on business income, petroleum and chemical feedstocks, and by assessing the parties who put wastes into the site. Congress passed EPCRA, the Emergency Planning and Community Right to Know Act, as part of a package of amendments to the Superfund law. This law is also known as Title III of the Superfund Amendments and Reauthorization Act, or SARA. EPCRA is a lot like hazardous communication for the community. It helps the community protect itself, just like MSDSs and learning about safe work practices help employees and facilities. Congress acted in response to the massive release in Bhopal, India, and to later accidents at home that sent hundreds to hospitals. EPCRA and programs like risk management rules under the Clean Air Act are aimed at preventing and limiting the effects of such accidents. Under EPCRA, the EPA requires facilities that use chemicals to work with local officials to plan for emergencies and to notify the community if a release occurs. They also must provide information on the chemicals they use to local emergency responders, like fire departments and hazmat teams. Information on chemicals that are released into the environment as wastes or emitted into the air or water under pollution permits is also collected. The EPA gathers the information each year and compiles it into a database called the Toxins Release Inventory. It covers more than 600 chemicals, with releases totaling billions of pounds. The idea is to give the EPA and communities a total picture of chemical use and environmental load. The overall goal of EPCRA is to inform communities of all chemicals that are present and to help them prepare to respond to an actual emergency. This is done through a system of state emergency response commissions called CERCs and local groups called Local Emergency Planning Committees, or LEPCs. Under EPCRA, facilities provide lists and locations of chemicals and quantities held, as well as MSDSs for each one. The LEPCs, fire departments, and other local agencies gather the MSDSs and other chemical information into a plan for dealing with chemical emergencies, like spills and explosions. This allows community responders to know what kinds of equipment and personnel they would need if an accident occurred. The idea is to give people in the community the same kinds of information about hazards that the people in the facility have. That's why information collected under the law is available to the public. Facilities spend a lot of time gathering and submitting the MSDSs and other information that are required under EPCRA. Many also work with the local community on emergency planning and develop advisory groups and other networks within the community. This helps the community understand the work the facility is doing and helps the facility respond to community concerns. People who work in facilities that use chemicals may be asked to serve on the local LEPC. They also may be asked to speak before community groups or be involved in tours of the facility. Workers at the facility must know what to do when an emergency occurs, what steps to take, and who to notify. The EPA uses air, water, and waste laws to prevent environmental pollution by chemicals, wastes, or byproducts of various processes. But health and the environment also need to be protected when products are manufactured or used. The EPA deals with this situation under two major laws: the Toxic Substances Control Act, or TSCA, and the Federal Insecticide, Fungicide, and Rodenticide Act, or FIFRA. FIFRA is the pesticide law. Under it, the EPA controls the safety and use of products that control pests, ranging from bacteria and bugs to weeds and slugs. TSCA gives the EPA broad authority to gather information on chemical safety and to regulate hazards that do not fit under other laws. Congress enacted TSCA in 1976 as part of the wave of environmental control laws passed in the 1970s and 1980s. It is viewed as a sort of mop-up law. It creates a system for the EPA to control toxic hazards that fall through the holes in the environmental protection web. Under TSCA, the EPA is authorized to gather health, safety, exposure, and other information on chemicals. The agency can require testing of chemicals to evaluate their safety and health effects, and may use TSCA to set use and exposure limits. The EPA carries out the law by dividing chemicals into two groups. The first group is new chemicals that first were made or imported since the law took effect on January 1, 1977. There are about 2,000 of these each year. The second group is existing chemicals that were in production or being imported when TSCA became law. There are about 70,000 of these. Whenever a company wants to make or import a new chemical, it must get permission from the EPA. This is done by submitting a pre-manufacture notification, or PMN, to the EPA. Using the data submitted with the PMN, the EPA evaluates the new substance for safety and health effects. Most of the 2,000 PMNs received each year are approved quickly. For substances that may pose hazards, the EPA can ask the manufacturer to submit additional information. It also may impose controls or precautions to reduce or eliminate any problems it foresees. The goal is to make sure the effects of new chemicals are discovered before the chemicals are created and pumped into the environment. Most of the remainder of TSCA deals with existing chemicals. These include all chemicals that already were being made or imported, plus all new chemicals that have been approved for manufacture under the PMN process. One way the EPA monitors existing chemicals is by issuing test rules to evaluate suspected health or environmental problems. The manufacturers must conduct the testing according to the rule and submit the results to the EPA. Depending on the kinds of effects that are being evaluated, this can take years and is very expensive. Once results are in, the EPA may impose controls or limit uses if it decides the chemical poses an unreasonable risk. These controls can range from banning the chemical from production or import to imposing restrictions on its handling and use. Under TSCA, the EPA also is authorized to order manufacturers and users to submit information about chemicals. Called reporting rules, this data collection helps the EPA gather information on chemicals being considered for regulation. The EPA also might issue a reporting rule at the request of another agency. OSHA, for example, might ask the EPA to issue a reporting rule if it wanted to know about use and exposure to a specific substance. TSCA also recognizes that people making and using chemicals, ranging from manufacturers to employees or consumers, might be the first ones to notice a problem. That's why the law requires people to report the information to the EPA when they notice a health or environmental effect from a chemical. One type of this reporting is called substantial risk notices. People who discover that a chemical poses a substantial risk to health or the environment must notify the EPA immediately. A second kind of hazard reporting deals with significant adverse reactions to chemicals. These also must be reported to the EPA if they are not already known. An example would be if a user or manufacturer of a chemical found that it was causing a skin rash. Unless this effect is already known, such as being reported in scientific literature or on the material safety data sheet for the substance, it must be reported to the EPA. TSCA has many uses. Other government agencies, such as OSHA or the Consumer Product Safety Commission, may ask the EPA to use TSCA to collect chemical and hazard information. The law also is used to regulate substances whose uses or hazards extend beyond the control of any single law or agency. The EPA has used TSCA to evaluate the hazards of new biotechnology products. It also led to the creation of a program to make sure people removing asbestos were trained to do the job properly, a similar program dealing with hazards posed by lead paint. TSCA has also been used to ban many uses of chlorofluorocarbons, or CFCs. The EPA has also worked with other agencies to control CFCs in aerosol sprays and some kinds of air conditioning and refrigeration equipment. The CFC actions were taken in response to studies that showed the chemicals damaged the Earth's ozone layer. This is the layer in the atmosphere that helps control temperature and climate. A good example of data collection about chemicals is the Toxins Release Inventory, called the TRI. Authorized under the Emergency Planning and Right to Know Act, EPCRA, the inventory is carried out by EPA's Office of Pollution Prevention, Pesticides, and Toxic Substances. The TRI is a collection of information on the location and annual amounts of more than 600 chemicals that are deposited into the environment. The amounts total billions of pounds each year. TRI materials can be substances disposed as wastes or emitted into the air or water under pollution permits. Substances sent off-site for treatment, recycling, or other disposal also are included. Under the TRI, covered facilities must report the chemicals released into the local environment during the preceding year, the amount of each chemical that went into the air, water, and land that year, the amount that was transported away from the reporting facility for disposal, treatment, recycling, or energy recovery, how chemical wastes were treated at the reporting facility, the efficiency of waste treatment. About 80,000 TRI reports are filed each summer. Two kinds of releases are reported, those that occur on-site and amounts that are shipped off-site. Once all the TRI data are received, the EPA collects the information into a database that is available to the public. People and government agencies can use it to see what is going on in a specific area or community or with a specific chemical or company. The TRI is considered to be a cornerstone of the Right to Know movement. TRI controls releases in the environment outside the workplace, while the OSHA Hazard Communications Standard controls releases in the workplace. The EPA rules under TSCA impose a significant burden on facilities. They must track and monitor chemicals and uses, get approval before making or importing a new substance, constantly be alert for reactions to chemicals and watch for hazards that turn up, test chemicals when needed, which can cost tens of thousands of dollars and take years to complete. Many of these responsibilities are spelled out in rules written by OSHA and other agencies as part of the government's united effort to protect both people and the environment from chemical hazards. Let's examine how you can help your facility comply with TSCA. Watch for chemical hazards and effects and report anything that you observe. Never introduce a new chemical or modify an operation without approval. Even a small change could create problems and bring the EPA enforcement personnel to your facility's door. Know what you're doing before you experiment with chemicals and mixtures. This kind of work takes special training because ordinary materials can have hazardous effects when mixed or heated. Keep accurate records and documentation if this is part of your job. This is a very important part of TSCA compliance and must be done diligently and carefully. The final major law that falls to the EPA is FIFRA, which is used to approve and regulate any substance used to kill pests. Intended use is the criterion the EPA applies to determine whether a particular product falls under the law. If a substance is sold to control pests, then it is considered to be a pesticide. Under FIFRA, the EPA must balance the economic benefits of using a pesticide against the environmental costs. This is a tough job because many pesticides kill both unwanted pests and beneficial organisms. Anyone who's sprayed weed killer in the yard and killed the flowers knows how this works. Examples of things that the EPA regulates as pesticides under FIFRA are insecticides, fungicides, and herbicides, which are more commonly known as weed killers. Disinfectants. Lamps that electrocute bugs. Products that repel pests with sound. Things that attract or repel pests with smell or taste. Swimming pool chemicals. Paint additives that inhibit mildew. Substances that keep barnacles or weeds from growing on boats and docks. Even living organisms like bacteria are considered pesticides if they're used to kill off unwanted pests. Many of the newer pesticides are based on this principle, where a natural organism is used to control an unwanted organism that it destroys, consumes, or prevents from growing. Most pesticides, however, continue to be insecticides and herbicides used on agricultural crops and food products. Government authority over pesticides can be somewhat confusing. The EPA regulates pesticide safety, manufacture, and use, including application rates and tolerances. The Department of Agriculture and the Food and Drug Administration regulate the amount that remains in processed food and meat. Since it was enacted in 1972, the EPA has used FIFRA to ban or eliminate the use of over 230 pesticides and 20,000 pesticide products. These numbers vary so much because a single pesticide may be used in many different pesticide products. DDT is one of the pesticides that was banned under FIFRA. DDT began much of the environmental movement when people discovered that animals, and especially birds, were dying because of it. The problem was that DDT used on farm fields and to kill mosquitoes collected in worms, rodents, and fish. When birds, like the bald eagle, ate their prey, the DDT made their shells so weak that the eggs broke when the parent sat on them. Pesticide programs and regulations at the EPA have four major goals: bringing safer pesticides to market, promoting programs that reduce the amount of pesticides applied to crops, increasing the safety of those pesticides that are applied, providing basic workplace protection for almost 4 million agricultural workers. The EPA regulates pesticides by a process called registration. Anyone who makes a pesticide claim for a product must obtain a pesticide registration from the EPA. Products on the market in the past must go through a similar process to continue to be sold. Pesticides are registered by applying to the EPA and providing information on the formulation, intended use, and hazards. The goal is to make sure the pesticide will not cause unreasonable risks to health or the environment. The EPA requires pesticide registrants to conduct specific tests on the pesticide. Depending on the type of pesticide, the agency can require more than 100 different tests. Many are very expensive and can take years to complete. The test results help the EPA evaluate potential adverse effects to humans, wildlife, fish, and plants, including endangered species. A pesticide is approved for use with conditions attached. These specify how it may be used and by whom, where it may be used, and in what concentrations. Protective gear needed when applying the pesticide and how long people must stay out of the area are additional conditions. These conditions of use are especially important because many pesticides are designed to be absorbed by their intended targets. However, they also can be absorbed by the people who apply them and others in the area. Absorption by humans can lead to a variety of health effects, from illness to reproductive problems. Some pesticides may even cause death if they get on the skin or are swallowed. Because of the dangers that some pesticides pose, some are approved for use only by people with special training and certification. These are sold in a controlled way and cannot be purchased by uncertified personnel. In some cases, a pesticide may be available in different strengths and formulations. In addition, a weaker version may be sold to the general public, while a stronger version is reserved for professional use. A key part of registering a pesticide is its label. This must be approved by the EPA. The label for a pesticide is a lot like an MSDS. It lists permitted uses, proper application, precautions, re-entry times, protective gear, disposal, and emergency response information. Violating the label conditions for a pesticide is a federal offense. This is because pesticides pose serious hazards if used improperly. Among these is harm to humans who apply them or who are in the area, and their ability to kill beneficial organisms through direct or indirect application. For facilities that make or use pesticides, FIFRA imposes serious responsibilities. These include obtaining necessary approvals before marketing, conducting testing to determine the effects and hazards, creating labels that carry proper precautionary and use information, making sure that labels are not removed or defaced, training employees to use pesticides properly and to wear the proper protective gear. Many of these responsibilities are spelled out in rules written by the EPA, OSHA, and other agencies as part of the government's united effort to protect both people and the environment. Always wear proper protective gear and follow label directions exactly whenever applying pesticides. Never use more than the directions specify. It will not be more effective, but it will create greater hazards. Pay attention to pesticide postings and warning flags. These are designed to keep people out of a treated area until it is safe to re-enter. Keep pesticides in their original containers. Apply them from containers designed for their use. Residues can remain that will contaminate later use of the container. Never put a pesticide into a container originally designed for food or drinks. Many people, especially children, have been poisoned by eating or drinking from a container that they thought contained a treat or milk. Know what to do in an emergency. This information is on the label. Read it before you use the product and know what you will do if an emergency arises. Dispose of leftover pesticides properly. Never pour them into the water or onto the ground. Most pesticides are hazardous and must be disposed of carefully. The label explains the required disposal procedures. Never take work pesticides home or home pesticides to work. They're intended for different uses and have different requirements. Bringing pesticides into work without approval can cause your facility to be in violation of many environmental laws. Be sure to follow the training you received for pesticides and check with your supervisor if there is any information you don't understand.